My name is Marcus Thompson, and I live in Bend, Oregon. I was 25 when this happened, driving a delivery truck for a local distribution company. The job required long hours on the road, often through remote areas late at night. I'd heard stories from other drivers, tales of strange things on the highways, things that couldn't be explained, but I never paid much attention. That was until one night on Highway 97, heading south towards Klamath Falls. It was just past 3 a.m., the road deserted except for the occasional car. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seems to suck the warmth out of everything. The highway stretched ahead, a black ribbon cutting through the dense forest on either side. I was tired, my eyes heavy, but I was only an hour away from my destination. Suddenly, I saw something up ahead. A figure standing on the side of the road, illuminated by my headlights. It was a woman, dressed in a long, white gown, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She was barefoot, and as I got closer, I could see that her skin was pale, almost translucent. She looked lost, scared, and I slowed down, thinking she might need help. As I pulled up beside her, she turned to look at me, and that's when I noticed something was wrong. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and her expression was one of pure terror. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she pointed down the road, her hand shaking. I glanced in the direction she was pointing, but there was nothing there, just the empty highway stretching out into the darkness. When I turned back, the woman was gone. She had vanished, as if she had never been there. I sat there for a moment, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I started driving again, faster this time, eager to put as much distance between me and that spot as possible. But the night wasn't done with me yet. About 10 minutes later, I saw something else. A car, flipped over on the side of the road, smoke rising from the wreckage. I pulled over, grabbing my phone to call for help. But as I approached the car, I realized it was the same car I had seen earlier that night, hours ago, when I was heading in the opposite direction. It was impossible. It couldn't be the same car. But there it was, crushed and twisted, like it had been in that spot for days. And then I saw her again. The woman in the white gown, standing a few feet away, watching me with those dark, hollow eyes. This time, she didn't disappear. She just stood there, staring at me, her face expressionless. I ran back to my truck and drove off, not stopping until I reached Klamath Falls. I reported the accident to the local authorities, but when they went to investigate, they found nothing. No car, no wreckage, no woman. It was as if it had never happened. I don't drive that route anymore. In fact, I avoid night shifts altogether. But every now and then, I hear about other drivers, ones who've seen a woman in white on Highway 97, and I wonder how many of them made it out alive. My name is Aaron Castillo, and I was 32 when I took a job as a security guard at St. Michael's Hospital in Tucson, Arizona. The hospital was old, a relic from the 1950s, and had a reputation among the staff for being haunted. I didn't believe in ghosts, so I didn't think much of it when I accepted the night shift. I needed the money, and the job seemed easy enough. Walk the halls, check the cameras, keep an eye out for anything unusual. It was around 2 a.m. when I got the call from the nurse on duty. She sounded uneasy, said there was someone in the old wing of the hospital, a section that had been closed off for years. The doors were supposed to be locked, so I didn't understand how anyone could have gotten in there. But the nurse insisted she had seen someone on the monitors, an old man, wearing a hospital gown, wandering the empty halls. I made my way to the old wing, the lights flickering as I walked through the deserted corridors. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of disinfectant and decay. As I reached the doors to the closed-off section, I felt a sudden chill, a cold that seeped into my bones. I hesitated, hand hovering over the door handle, before finally pushing it open. The old wing was even more decrepit than I had imagined. The walls were cracked, paint peeling, and the floor was littered with debris. I swept my flashlight across the hallway, searching for any sign of the old man, but there was nothing. just the eerie silence of a place long forgotten. As I walked further in, I started to hear something, soft, almost imperceptible at first, like the sound of someone breathing. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached a room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, the faint light from the hallway casting a sliver of illumination inside. I pushed the door open and froze. There, sitting on the bed, was the old man. He was hunched over, his back to me, muttering something under his breath. His hospital gown was torn and stained, his skin pale and sickly. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I took a step closer, and that's when he turned around. His face was gaunt, hollowed out, like a corpse that had been left to rot. His eyes were empty, lifeless, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. He reached out a hand towards me, and I saw that his fingers were nothing but bone, flesh hanging off in ragged strips. I stumbled back, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The old man got up from the bed, moving towards me with a slow, deliberate gait. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the hallway. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop until I was back in the main part of the hospital, where the lights were bright and the nurses were going about their business as if nothing was wrong. I burst into the security office, gasping for breath, and checked the monitors. The old wing was empty, the halls silent and still. I quit that job the next day. I never told anyone what I saw, and I never went back to St. Michael's. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that breathing, that soft, raspy sound that haunts my dreams. My name is Ethan Parker, and I live in a small town called Orick, nestled deep within the forests of Northern California. I was 29 when this incident happened to me, working the graveyard shift at the local sawmill, a job that was supposed to be straightforward, just another night at work. But that night, something changed. I still get chills thinking about it. It was the kind of terror that lingers, the kind you can never quite shake off. The old sawmill in Orick had been around for as long as anyone could remember. It was a place of hard labour, where generations of men had worked, earning their living by turning ancient redwoods into planks of wood. The graveyard shift, however, was different. The mill was quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of the machines and the occasional creak of the old wooden structure. I had been working there for 3 years, and by then I was used to the solitude. I even liked it, the peace, the time to think. That night, though, was different. I felt it as soon as I clocked in. The air was thick, heavy with a strange kind of tension I couldn't quite place. Around midnight, I went out for a break, stepping outside to get some fresh air. The mill was surrounded by dense forest, and the only light came from the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. As I leaned against the railing, something caught my eye, a movement up on the ridge overlooking the mill. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but then it moved again, and I realized it was something else entirely. It was a shadow, but not like any shadow I'd ever seen. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it seemed to move with a purpose, gliding across the ridge as if it were watching me. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I shook it off, convincing myself that it was just a trick of the light, maybe my tired mind playing games with me. But deep down, I knew it was something more. I finished my break and went back inside, trying to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The machines, which had been running smoothly, suddenly started to malfunction. The lights flickered, casting the mill in an eerie, strobe-like glow. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The machines stopped, the lights went out, and I was plunged into darkness. I stood there, frozen, listening to the deafening silence. And then, I heard it. A soft, whispering sound, like someone or something was breathing right next to me. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness. but there was nothing there. I spun around, desperate to find the source of the sound, but all I could see were the empty, darkened corridors of the mill. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it again. The shadow, standing at the far end of the corridor, just outside the reach of my flashlight. It was closer now, and I could see that it wasn't just a shadow. It had form, substance, but it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It started to move towards me, slowly at first, then faster, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty mill as I made my way to the exit. I burst through the door and into the night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I never went back to that sawmill after that night. I quit the next day, no explanation given. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of too many late nights and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that was watching, waiting. And I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it wanted. My name is Jeff Simmons, and I was 34 when I started working at a distribution warehouse in Memphis, Tennessee. The pay was decent, and the night shifts were usually quiet, with just a few of us working to keep the place running smoothly. The warehouse was huge, a maze of towering shelves and narrow aisles, with the kind of silence that could drive a man crazy if he wasn't careful. One night, I was doing my usual rounds, checking inventory and making sure everything was in order. It was around 1 a.m. when I first noticed it. Something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving between the rows of shelves. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight in the direction of the movement, but there was nothing there, just rows and rows of boxes, stacked high, casting long, dark shadows across the floor. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination, and continued with my work. But as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could hear things, soft footsteps, the rustle of something moving just out of sight. And every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Around 3 a.m., I decided to take a break. I went to the break room, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat down, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. That's when I heard it, a loud crash, coming from somewhere deep within the warehouse. It was the sound of something heavy being knocked over, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, running. I jumped up, grabbing my flashlight, and ran towards the noise. The warehouse was dark, the overhead lights casting eerie shadows across the floor. I could feel my heart pounding as I made my way through the aisles, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the shelves. And then I saw it, a figure, standing at the far end of the aisle, just beyond the reach of my light. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring back at it, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, I took a step back, then another, my instincts screaming at me to run. The figure remained motionless, but I could feel its gaze following me as I backed away. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I called my supervisor, told him something was wrong in the warehouse, but when he arrived with the rest of the crew, there was nothing to be found. The shelves were intact, nothing out of place, no sign of anyone or anything. I quit the next day. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I knew I couldn't go back. The thought of that figure, watching me from the darkness, was enough to make my skin crawl. To this day, I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the result of too many late nights and too little sleep. Or maybe, just maybe, there's something in that warehouse. Something that comes out when the lights go down and the night takes over. My name is Robert Mason, and I live in Rochester, New York. I was 27 when this incident occurred. At the time, I was working as a night security guard at an office building downtown. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it paid the bills. My job was simple: patrol the building, check the doors, and monitor the security cameras from the control room. The building was old, built in the early 1900s, with a basement that always gave me the creeps. But up until that night, I hadn't experienced anything out of the ordinary. It was a cold November night, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The office floors were dark and deserted, the only light coming from the emergency exit signs casting an eerie glow. I was sitting in the control room, half watching the security feeds while sipping my coffee, trying to stay awake. The monotony of the job had lulled me into a sense of complacency, so when the phone rang, it startled me. The phone on my desk was an internal line, used only for building-related communications. At this hour, it never rang. I picked up the receiver, expecting it to be a misdial or a call from another guard in one of the neighbouring buildings. "Security office, Robert speaking," I said. At first there was silence, just a faint static crackling on the line. Then I heard it. A whisper, so soft I could barely make it out. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the static, but I could hear the desperation in it. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned forward, straining to hear. "Who is this? Where are you?" I asked, my voice edged with concern. "Basement, trapped. Please, help," the voice replied, barely above a whisper. The line went dead. I sat there, holding the receiver, my mind racing. The basement was supposed to be empty. The building's basement housed old storage rooms, mechanical equipment, and the building's boilers. There were no working offices down there, and no one had any reason to be there at this hour. But what if someone had somehow gotten trapped down there? Maybe a maintenance worker or a trespasser who had found their way into the building. I grabbed my flashlight and keys and headed for the basement. The elevator ride down felt agonizingly slow. My pulse quickened as the doors opened with a creak, revealing the dimly lit basement corridor. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic, like rust. I shone my flashlight down the corridor, the beam cutting through the darkness. The basement was a maze of old storage rooms, some of which hadn't been opened in years. As I walked, the sound of my footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, the only sound in the otherwise silent space. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is anyone down here?" No response, just the oppressive silence of the basement. I started checking the rooms one by one, my anxiety growing with each empty room. Finally, I reached the last door at the end of the corridor. It was an old, heavy metal door with a small, square window set into it, grime obscuring the view inside. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped out from the crack. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was pitch black, the beam of my flashlight barely penetrating the darkness. I could see old filing cabinets, stacks of dusty boxes, and what looked like old machinery long since abandoned. And then I saw it. A figure, hunched over in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. It was a man, his clothes ragged and dirty, his hair matted. He was rocking back and forth, muttering something under his breath. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing in the room. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. He just kept rocking back and forth, muttering to himself. I took a step closer, and that's when the smell hit me. A foul, nauseating stench that made me gag. It was the smell of decay. My heart pounded in my chest as I edged closer, trying to get a better look at the man. His muttering grew louder, more frantic, but I still couldn't make out what he was saying. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of there, but I couldn't just walk away. "Hey, I'm here to help you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let me take you upstairs." I reached out to touch his shoulder, but the moment my hand made contact, the man's muttering stopped. He went completely still, his head slowly turning to face me. When I saw his face, I felt my blood run cold. His eyes were wide, vacant, and his skin was pale, stretched tight over his skull. But the worst part was his mouth. It was twisted into a grotesque smile, his teeth yellowed and broken. And then, In a voice that was not his own, he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, tripping over a box and falling to the floor. My flashlight slipped from my hand, rolling away as the room plunged into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back in the control room with the door locked behind me. I called the police, barely able to explain what had happened. When they arrived, they searched the basement from top to bottom, but found nothing. The room at the end of the corridor was empty. No man, no boxes, nothing. It was as if he had never been there. The next day, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't stay in that building, not after what I had seen. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that basement, but I still hear his voice sometimes, late at night when I'm alone. "Help me!"